It was still dark when my father shook me awake next morning to say we were going to Loyola College to meet with the dean. I told him it was okay if he went, I'd stay in bed. This was my only step off the path of truth-seeking into defiance. It didn't last long. My father said, "We are going." We went. Father McGuigan, head dean of Loyola College, was more a figurehead than a person to me, like a prime minister or the Pope. But there we were in his surprisingly cramped office, sitting not 8 feet away from each other. His furrowed brow, black robe, and Roman collar were a disturbing sight at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning. My father explained that my boyfriend, a teaching assistant at his college, believed in premarital sex. Wouldn't this be grounds for firing him from the staff of a coeducational Catholic institute? The dean heard my father out and asked a question or two, which led my father to declare his ultimatum. If I were to act on this heresy I shared with Jim, I would no longer live at home, no longer have my education funded, no longer have contact with my younger brothers. This last point, my father explained, would be necessary to protect them from being corrupted by my beliefs. I'm sure Father McGuigan asked for my side of the story. I hope my voice was strong. I hope I was able to articulate my quest to reconcile the teachings of the Church with the innocence of my body's desires. That's another moment lost in time. What I do recall with utmost clarity is what happened next. "I've been trained by the Jesuits," said the dean, dividing eye contact between my father and me, "and the Jesuits value the skills of rhetoric and logic. In a debate, I could take either side of this issue before us and likely win." Now his eyes were only on me. "It seems what's more important than deciding who's right or wrong, Marianne, is for you to consider the consequences if you act on your beliefs. I suggest you go away and think about this." End of meeting. On the way home, I tried to tell my father the simple truth that I didn't want to hurt him, that I was only trying to make sense of two things that didn't fit together, my mind and my body. I no longer recall his actual words, but I clearly remember the message that I heard. "I love you less for what you're doing." It took me years to understand what I was doing. At the threshold of adulthood, I was faced with the monumental task of choosing from childhood what would serve me as an adult, and to discard the rest. Anyone who grows up in a family has to do it. But I hadn't yet got from my parents what children need to be truly ready to leave home. Today, I know the task in psychological terms: individuation, being a person separate from, but still connected to family, culture, and religion, or maybe not connected, depending on how it goes. I was trying to leave home and take my parents with me. In a large family, being seen is a nebulous thing. We 9 kids were very fortunate. My parents gave us almost everything we needed: food, shelter, security, love. Each of us had to figure out how to get the other necessary part of nurture: attention. I chose dutiful daughter and A student as my strategy. Before all this cracked open, Mother Grazia had seen my desire to go beyond good grades and duty, seen me as a young woman yearning to find a bit of wisdom. My parents saw a daughter on the brink of committing mortal sin, thereby condemning herself to an eternity in hell. As I look back, I also wonder how much I unconsciously wanted to blow up my good girl persona and get my parents' attention a whole other way. Any positive outcome was doomed, but it surely was a guaranteed method to redirect my own trajectory as a nice middle-class young woman. You'd think something momentous would have followed this encounter with the church. What happened was that everything went back to what I imagined my parents were praying for, to so-called normal. I was left with the task that Father McGuigan had assigned me, to think about the consequences of the beliefs I was contemplating. The most critical issue for me was what my father had made clear: that I would have restricted access to family if I acted on my beliefs. I couldn't bear the thought. The company of my older siblings had been an essential part of my growing up years. My youngest brothers and I had just made our way through the Narnia Chronicles, me doing different voices for each of the main characters. What we lacked in parental hands-on, we gave to each other. Could I risk such an enormous loss? My mother and father, on their part, continued on with their own task, the demanding job of raising 9 children. They never revisited the topic. It was late fall by then, end of term exams, Christmas holidays, and New Year. In mid-January, overwhelmed by what seemed like an insoluble predicament, I took as much of a bottle of Tylenol as I could swallow. The pills didn't stay down for long, but the dose was enough to put me in bed for days. Once I was back on my feet, I skipped classes and walked through snowdrifts to Jim's apartment. My tingling cold skin on his sleep-warm body was my first experience of the erotic. Either that time or the next, being the daughter of a fertile mother, I was pregnant. Now comes another sequence of the bizarre in this coming-of-age story. I had a best friend at Marymount College, Charlotte, who was also a good girl going bad. Our favorite pastime was reading and writing poetry. In response to parental attempts to protect her virginity, Charlotte had moved out of the family home, got a job, had sex with her paramour, oh, we loved that word, and was now back home again, 2 months pregnant and planning her wedding. Her distraught mother, perhaps feeling the mother-daughter bond was already broken, had taken license to read Charlotte's journal. Tucked in its pages, she found a poem by me that I had given Charlotte a year earlier. Now, this poem was a florid early attempt to capture my amazement at the beauty of the world in rhyme. What else do good girls write about at 19? The first line was, "I am pregnant with the love of life." Likely, Charlotte's mother only got halfway through that sentiment. Given that she lived in Quebec City and my family home was in Dorval, and each city had its own yellow pages, it was a considerable feat that she tracked down our home phone number. She called to let my parents know I was with child. By now it was early May, end of term, and I was studying for finals. My plan was to tell my parents that I was 3 months along as soon as I wrote my last exam. I was coping with exhaustion, nausea, and terror. I remember I was in my brother Anthony's bedroom poring over my notes from Psychology 101 in the hopes that I would be less likely to fall asleep in unfamiliar surroundings. My mother came heavily up the stairs and sat on his bed. "I just had the strangest phone call from Charlotte's mother," she said. "She found a poem of yours and she says it's about you being pregnant." I could tell my mother found this idea incredulous. She was waiting for me to say, "Oh, Charlotte's mother, she's so strange." I did say, in a somewhat affronted tone, that poem was about being in love with beauty. It pains me now to remember the relief on my mother's face in that moment before I took another breath and added, "But I am pregnant." The incongruous truth is that neither my parents nor my boyfriend and I, none of us, had up to that point addressed this likelihood. My mother and father were grappling with what God, the church, and the family would think of us. Jim and I were clawing our way out of a system of values that no longer made sense to us. No one was imagining this tiny soul that had come into being while we were floundering around in our heads. Would anything have been different if we had been having those kinds of conversations? Another thing I'll never know. It was called a shotgun wedding in those days. A local church agreed to accommodate both Mass and matrimonial ceremony on Saturday, May 22nd, 1966. Thinking about it from this distance, perhaps this venue was chosen precisely because it was not in our parish, and therefore less likely to draw the curiosity of neighbors passing by. No shotgun in sight, but I felt my hands raised in surrender as I walked up the aisle. My white linen knee-length dress had a matching coat which allowed for photographs from any angle without revealing my emerging belly. My paternal grandmother was the only relative besides the immediate family to attend the service and come back to our home for a meal. I think about my sweet 6 younger brothers, ages 5 to 15 years of age. How did they make sense of the mood of the day? This being the first wedding they had ever attended, perhaps what they learned was that marriage is a somber occasion. Lightheartedness arrived with 2 friends on a motorcycle wearing top hats. They crashed the family gathering with rowdy good humor, reminding Jim and me that there would be life again after this moment in time. The next step, my parents insisted, was that we leave town before my pregnancy started to show. I packed my sparse adolescent keepsakes in 2 boxes and stored them in my parents' basement. Jim and I headed to Toronto, where his sister was offering a roof and a bed in the basement. Janet had a 3-year-old daughter and twin 6-month-olds. I was comforted by the presence of children and the familiarity of the role of mother's helper. The most vivid memory I have of my pregnancy was the moment when I held one of the roly-poly twins and felt a whack to my belly. I looked down at the 2 tiny feet kicking the air in my lap, and I didn't understand. Until I did. It was the other baby, the one under this baby, that had butted the one on my lap. My baby. All the angst and struggle of the last months crystallized in this moment. There was life in me.